Hello all and welcome to Risk Out's webinar from a galaxy far, far away, SAR Wars, the Law Enforcement Awakens. We are so excited to have you here joining us today. Now, before we dive into today's content, let's roll through some quick housekeeping items. Risk Out will be sharing all of today's webinar resources, including the slides, the handouts, and a recording of today's session in a follow-up email tomorrow, so keep an eye on your inbox. We also want these sessions to be as valuable to you as possible, so we encourage you to ask any questions that you may have throughout today's session in the questions section of the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. We'll also be running a few polls throughout today's webinar to better understand you as our audience, so your participation is greatly appreciated. In April, Risk Out will be hosting a webinar entitled Preparing for 420. Specialty Banking and Cannabis Programs Unpacked, where attendees will gain valuable insights into the intricacies of higher risk markets, from recruiting specialized staff to setting realistic expectations and leveraging the right tools for success. If unlocking new markets is a growth strategy for you and your financial institution in 2024, this is a webinar you won't want to miss. You can reserve your seat today at riskout.com. Now, for those of you that are joining us today for the first time, welcome. And Risk Out is a team of former bankers, regulators, and industry experts that have joined together to help community financial institutions unlock complex markets and streamline compliance processes to increase revenue while decreasing your stress. Through both software and services, Risk Out reduces the time, effort, and uncertainty around BSA AML processes, as well as expanding into new markets so you can sleep better at night while keeping your community safer from financial crimes. If you're interested in learning more, visit riskout.com and get in touch. Today, we are proud to be joined by Kristen Parker, Risk Out's Vice President of Compliance and Operations. Prior to joining Risk Out, Kristen worked on both fraud and BSA teams, where she successfully created and implemented BSA monitoring programs at community financial institutions for varying higher risk industries like hemp, MSBs, ATMs, cannabis, and more. She was also recently selected by her peers as PBC's Compliance Person of the Year. We are very excited to have her joining us today. And without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it over to Kristen to dive into today's webinar content. Take it away, Kristen.
It'd help if I was off mute, right?
It would.
Well, it's lovely to be here with you guys today. I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm not in my Leia, cinnamon roll hairstyle, but hopefully we have a great webinar today. I am looking forward to SARs are one of my favorite subjects to talk to you guys about, talk about in general. I nerd out over them because they're so important, they're so critical. I think it's really going to be beneficial for you to learn how to really write effective SARs, because when we really boil it down, that's what our jobs are really about, is safeguarding our financial institutions, safeguarding the financial integrity of the U.S. and helping out law enforcement. How do we do that? We will walk through that today. So in today's agenda, we'll be talking about and defining what SARs are. We will talk about the goals and objectives of SARs. We're going to talk about the life cycle of a SAR. What happens after you press submit to FinCEN? We are going to talk about making an informed SAR decision. Do you file a SAR? Do you not file a SAR? If you don't file a SAR, what should you be documenting? And then crafting an effective SAR narrative, and then collaborating with law enforcement. And then we'll have a good Q&A session. So I will try not to talk your ears off, because I also would love for this to be interactive together too, for you to be able to ask your questions. And we also have a really neat handout today, which is walking through some of the steps we're talking about when creating a SAR narrative. That handout also has some examples of how to write certain SARs, so you can follow that as well. So I think that's going to be handy. You'll definitely want to download that for your content.
Excellent. That brings us to our first poll question today, which you should see popping up on your screen right now. And that asks, how many SARs did your financial institution file in the past year? You can select any one of the following: between 1 and 50 SARs, between 50 and 100, over 100, or maybe you're just not sure. And that's totally fine as well. We'll give everyone just a couple more seconds here to get their responses in, and we will see how they stack up to what Kristen was expecting. Excellent. Thank you all for participating. Looks like over half of the financial institutions that we have here on the line today are filing over 100 SARs in the past year. 28% of those are on the lower end of the spectrum, between 1 and 50, 12% falling between that 50 and 100 mark, only 7% being unsure. Kristen, I'm curious, how does this stack up to what you're expecting to see?
Yeah, I think it would have been great if we were able to dial it down by asset size, but we don't have time for a whole nother hour of webinars to that. But yeah, people are filing SARs. You'll see in a statistic I'll show here in a minute that more and more institutions are filing SARs, and you know that's a great thing to do. But so long as it's done for the right reason, so long as it's just not a check the box activity, you know, I think we all kind of get lost in the sauce sometimes of what BSA generally. The intent of it is. So I think it's going to be good for us to just get a refresher reset today. You know, as you guys are obviously filing a lot of SARs, I think it'd be good for us to all be on the same page of what the expectations are there. So let's start by talking about what a SAR is. You know, if you're here today, you probably know that a SAR stands for suspicious activity reporting. That is simply a way to say that we as a financial institution are here to report anything that we find falling as suspicious, falling under, you know, certain dollar amounts to law enforcement, to aid them in detecting and then assisting them with any of the information that we may have that may aid them in their efforts for being able to identify suspicious activity. Those dollar amounts can range from $5,000. So if you have any suspicious activity for $5,000 and you can identify a subject, then you should be filing a SAR. If you cannot identify a subject, but that activity aggregates $25,000 or more, then you are to file a SAR. You actually, instead of 30 days from detecting and determining that activity was suspicious like you did with the $5,000 increment, you have 60 days if you don't have a subject to file your initial SAR filing for that $25,000 threshold. And then if it's insider abuse, any type of insider abuse happening, you should file that SAR for any dollar amount, not $5,000 or more. And you know, there's all sorts of different viewpoints of that dollar threshold being too low. I can kind of agree with that in some aspects, but let's just say if you had a bad actor do $5,000 here and then $5,000 at many other institutions worth of suspicious activity, that on aggregate could probably add up pretty quickly. So while it can be feeling a little bit cumbersome because $5,000 seems like not much of anything anymore, unfortunately, this is something that has been in practice a long time, and it has proven to show that it does work. The goals and objectives under SAR filings are to detect suspicious activity and ensure compliance. So that's identifying it at your institution and reporting it according to those rules that we briefly went over. Then it's to support law enforcement, right? So our point is not just to check a box that says we have found $5,000 of something, we can't tell if it's suspicious or not, so we're just going to report it. If it falls into the bucket and it's not useful to law enforcement, then it's what's the point? What is really the point, guys? And then it's also to help maintain financial stability in the financial system. So we're going to continue to, by reporting this, help protect the integrity of the US financial system, addressing any potential threats and vulnerabilities to our own communities that we live in. And then it's facilitating collaboration between law enforcement and your financial institution as well. We'll go into that a little bit deeper in an upcoming slide. When I was researching what's been happening in the SAR world since I left it about 3.5 years ago, I think I think it's really important to realize, and when I was pulling the numbers, how many institutions, how the growth of SAR filings have occurred. So the data that FinCEN provides is up until 2022. So I can imagine this has grown over time. So my experience in filing SARs, goes back a long time. And we didn't really have a lot of resources back then that kind of helped guide us on what the right way to file a SAR or not file a SAR, documenting everything. You always have the FFIEC manual, right? Like I still carry my 2014 one and just keep shoving in the updates into there because I'm a paper lover. So to see this trend over time, it can tell us a couple different things, right? It can tell us that more and more institutions are either getting more sophisticated in what they're reporting, the regulatory expectations are coming down harder on detecting suspicious activity, that we are also seeing these institutions get better, potentially, in some cases, some technology that may help them. Maybe they're also doing more training on the front line to help detect suspicious activity even before it gets through the technology filters to help them deter. And we're also, it kind of shows that maybe people are doing things a little bit fishier, right, than they used to. And money's moving quicker, and it's hard to tell what's going on in the financial system all the time. So they are filing more frequent SARs because money is sometimes harder to follow when things are real time, right? So we're seeing significant growth. We're almost seeing it doubling in the last 8 years. The surge, I was like, I wonder if this has something to potentially do with the uptick in required SAR filings because of cannabis banking. So we're at the 10-year anniversary as of about a week and a half ago of the 2014 MRB guidance that came out that required financial institutions to file suspicious activity reports on any cannabis business, regardless of whether it's doing something illicit or not within that state. So I thought, wow, that's got to correlate pretty closely to this uptick. But if you do the research, and I pulled the numbers down of the SAR filings that have happened in that same time frame, it actually only accounts for about 2% of the total SARs annually. So this uptick is truly just not cannabis related. Most of it's related to other suspicious activity. So if we're filing this many SARs, we really need to think about why we're doing it and how we can do it more efficiently, effectively, so that law enforcement actually has the information in hand with actionable items to investigate. So what law enforcement agencies really utilize SARs? All of them essentially. And it goes beyond these here. These are the main ones that are pulling down SARs. FinCEN is the receiver of SARs. We'll go over that just in a minute. And then they hold that database. They hold those SARs in a database that can be accessed by these different agencies. Now, just because they can access it through those databases doesn't mean that they are very frequently. I have great relationships with some members of the FBI and different law enforcement agencies. And frankly, because of the volume of SARs, they oftentimes don't have a whole lot of staffing to be able to go through all of them. So that's where we have spent time with law enforcement to really understand what is it that would help them in their efforts to detect. What can we do better so that what we're reporting can lead to something that they may be able to prosecute, right? If our instincts are to be true. So when FinCEN gets these reports in, they have the ability to also go ahead and divvy them out to these different agencies as well. Any agency can access that database. The ones that are specifically sent down to these other agencies, they may have interest or have heard of other activities around what you're reporting that are specific to a case that these particular agencies are investigating. It's really a fascinating whole setup that they have for SAR reporting. And when you really start to learn more about what happens in the journey of a SAR, you starts to click a little bit better as to why it's so important for you to get your SAR reporting correct. So when you initially submit a SAR, it goes to FinCEN, and again, FinCEN is an arm of the U.S. Department of Treasury. FinCEN stands for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. When it goes there, again, they can divvy it out to different agencies, but everybody can access that database. FinCEN also will aggregate these SARs. So if there's commonalities between subjects, so if at bank A, credit union A, so on and so forth are submitting, if they're submitting accurate subject information, FinCEN is able to aggregate that subject information, and that can lead to certain investigations at these different agencies we just spoke about. So if the information in aggregate totals a certain dollar amount, that dollar amount can vary between different agencies. That's when usually FinCEN will put the effort into contacting that specific agency to say, hey, we noticed that XYZ is happening and it seems to fit in your bucket, IRS, because it appears to all be kind of tax evasion, tax related. Can be different scenarios like that. Once it gets to FinCEN, the law enforcement agencies will access it whenever they need to, or if they have an open investigation, they will go and often just run some names in the database to see if there's been any suspicious activity reports submitted on their particular folks that they are investigating at that moment. If they have time, some agents will actually make time, if it's not part of their normal job, to at least once a month, sometimes unfortunately just once a quarter, have a group of them get into a room and then just go through the SARs to see what might be something that might pique their interest for further investigation. When law enforcement utilizes the SARs, they sometimes are feeding that information back to FinCEN on impact reporting, and that helps FinCEN that's where you see some of this memo guidance come out from in regards to SARs and best practices come out. It's really interestingly enough, when FinCEN does get the SAR report, you know how when we file a SAR, go through all those different pages, check all those boxes, fill in all the subject information, write our narrative up. But when we go ahead and we submit that back over to FinCEN, when law enforcement looks at that report is just one long text string. So it's not broken out and parsed out into different areas where they can easily kind of move through it. That's why it's so critical for you in your narrative to say something very impactful within your first couple of words so that it piques their interest to look further. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But when you're thinking about looking at a text string that could be potentially miles long worth of text string, if you're not interested in the first couple of one or two sentences, you're not going to spend your time on that if you don't already have an open investigation on somebody. So I think it's important to realize that this life cycle, I wish so badly that we could get reports on how our SARs have been involved in law enforcement, but I don't unfortunately think that'll ever happen. The best satisfaction I ever got was after either me or my team filed a SAR. It may be years from now, but you finally get a subpoena and you're like, I knew it. I knew that person was doing something. That's about as much satisfaction as you unfortunately can get sometimes, but know that there is a cycle to this, and sometimes it does take time. There's also times when you should be speaking to law enforcement right away. We'll go into more detail about that shortly. So how do you make a strategic SAR decision, right? A lot of institutions have either no software to help them, meaning no transaction monitoring system. They are relying solely on the paper-based method of maybe pulling some SharePoint reports, maybe looking through some monetary instrument logs, certain own curated reports, pivot tables of transaction data. Maybe they have some known bad actors. They may not have the right tools in their pocket to help them be able to quickly make those decisions. So it's really important, no matter how you're running it, whether it's manually or with software, that you've thought through what it takes to actually make an informed approach to your SARs. So we always start with information gathering, right? No matter where you got that hunch that something didn't smell right, something was wrong with whatever you think this transaction was, you start by gathering more information on that transaction. So you could have information come in from the front line that saw something suspicious. You could have it come from your SharePoint reports or your transaction monitoring system, but that is just only step one. That does not determine whether or not something is suspicious. It takes an investigative effort. Sometimes you can quickly say, that's fraud. I know that's 100% fraud. Make your decision, close that account, file your SAR, move on with your life. But other times it does take a little bit more effort. You're going to collect that information and you're going to analyze it. Is it normal for the pattern of behavior for that customer? If it's not, is there an outlier of a situation that may have made that situation abnormal, but not necessarily suspicious? You can think of, I'm in a town where there's a high elder population. We had a lot of elder abuse in our area, but we also had a time of the year where, end of the year, where these wealthier individuals were handing out checks, yearly checks to their offspring for tax purposes, whatever. We had to learn that pattern of behavior because that didn't necessarily lean into elder abuse, but it did lean into potential other issues, right? So we had to determine whether that was normal or not. Then we have the risk assessment, right? So that's part of, once we gather that data, we determine whether or not, based on the information that we have, is there an elevated risk? Is there an elevated risk to this potential activity this customer is? Does it lean into, is there fraud? Is there elder abuse? Is there money laundering? Is there structuring? Is there all sorts of different things? Based on what we've learned, if we have a subject and it reaches more than $5,000 and we can't wrap our head around whether or not this is truly something suspicious or not, then we need to determine whether or not we're going to file a SAR. We're going to ensure that whatever our policies and procedures say, we're going to follow that. We're going to follow our SAR decision through our policies and procedures. So that SAR decision can mean whether or not your junior analyst is out here reviewing a document, determines something is suspicious, and then escalates it to the BSA officer who has the final decision to file SAR. Other times, that involves a committee where that SAR decision is made through a committee of individuals. Personally, I think committees can get a little bit tiresome. They can get a little bit too opinionated, especially if your SAR committee consists of people outside of BSA. Maybe it's more key executives. The FFIEC manual clearly distinguishes if it's made by committee, you should have something written out in there about how you're going to deal with people arguing basically over what the decision is. But SARs are subjective, SAR filings are subjective. Sometimes they can get political too. If there's a lot of political capital in what is happening with a certain customer at your institution that is more high stake, and you have more voices involved in whether or not a SAR should be filed on that individual, because you get what I'm saying here. It can get a little bit dicey in that space. So, consider that when you're thinking about setting up a SAR committee. But regardless of what your policy or states, whether you go through one person or you go through a committee, follow that procedure to determine whether or not a SAR needs to be filed. And then if you choose not to file a SAR, you choose to file a SAR, then you need to rationalize that in a document, right? Whether that be the case, whether that be some other separate document that you have, the rationale behind why you didn't file a SAR is just as important as the rationale behind why you did file a SAR. So have that supporting documentation, have it all wrapped up in a pretty little bow. If it's not documented in this world, it didn't happen. So make sure you have everything documented clearly about what your decision is, and then move forward based on that.
Alrighty, that brings us to our second poll question, which should be coming up on your screen. And believe it or not, it's another question about SARs. That one asks, how many times did you collaborate with law enforcement on a SAR that was filed by your financial institution in the past year? Options are between 1 and 10 times, between 10 and 25, maybe more than 25 times, or not at all. I didn't collaborate with law enforcement even one time in the past year over a SAR. I'll give y'all just one more second to get these responses in. All righty. Thank you so much again for all of those that participated. You can see our results here on the screen. Over half of our audience is in that 1 to 10 range. So they're engaging with law enforcement to some extent, but definitely not extensively. 10% roughly are a little bit more than that, less than 25, more than 10. About a third of our audience isn't engaging at all, and only a very small minority is engaging over 25 times in an annual basis with law enforcement. Kristen, how does this stack up to what you were expecting?
Pretty in line with what I expected. The fact that some of you are even getting to engage at all about 25 times, that's pretty exciting stuff. You must be good at writing good SARs or have good collaborative efforts there. And, you know, the lack of law enforcement contact doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong either. It just may be luck of the draw. Maybe you do have a pretty squeaky clean institution. I find more oftentimes than not is that the more nefarious activity seems to happen at the smaller institutions as opposed to the larger institutions, because the bad actors believe that those who, if they target a smaller institution, they're not sophisticated enough to catch that activity, right? And that may be the case in some scenarios. If you have a small BSA team, maybe they just drew the short straw out of the hat and became the BSA officer. You know, maybe they were just a former teller, not well trained. Maybe they're right. Maybe they can get away with a little bit more because people don't know what they don't know. But majority of the time, you know, with law enforcement, you'll find that as you start to get to know them and engage with them, they're more likely to start looking for SARs that are specifically filed for your institution as well, because the name of the game is not, you know, not to have any not suspicious activity at your institution. Because you're finding suspicious activity means you're doing something right, guys. It doesn't make you a bad institution. It doesn't mean that your product offerings are bad or you just have a whole bunch of bad actors in your community or everything like that. It means that you built a safe program that is there and has ways to detect illicit activities. So the more SARs you're filing, if they're done for the right purposes, doesn't mean that your bank is in, or your credit union is in bad shape either. So really interesting results there. All right, let's talk about law enforcement response rate. Sometimes we call this SAR hit rate. That can sometimes mean just SAR hit rate coming off of how many alerts did I get, and then how many of those escalated into a case, and then how many of those escalate into a SAR. But a lot of institutions don't dig further into that and says, okay, my SAR hit rate was 25%. Ooh, fancy, my rules are dialed in. That means squat if you're law enforcement, if you're, you know, again, nobody's contacting you from law enforcement, you haven't engaged with them at all. Again, like I said earlier, you may be doing everything right and by the book, that's great, but then it's really good to have this measurement of what's my response rate from law enforcement. So law enforcement's responsiveness to the SARs filed is what your response rate is. And it matters because it could mean that the quality of your SARs or your relationship with law enforcement, if the more they're contacting you, the more potentially quality leads you're allowing them, you know, you're giving to them. You're helping them find these bad actors, right? So the more you start to dial in on that law enforcement response rate, the more you're going to figure out where your nuances are, where, you know, what you could be doing better potentially. Are you just reporting for the sake of reporting and you're checking a box and moving on with your life? That's not necessarily the right move either, right? There are certain regulatory requirements, but, you know, writing an effective SAR narrative and having a relationship with law enforcement is really the name of the game in the end. And if we want to simplify what we do and what our jobs and our roles are as BSA individuals, it's to detect and deter illicit activity. Detect, deter, report. That should be the key there. So when we want to talk about creating and crafting an effective SAR narrative, we really dial that into 6 really important components. Establishing compelling context. Tell me the juicy stuff. Let me know what it's like. Tell me, provide a background on the suspicious activity, anything that you've dug up. We want to build intriguing characters. We don't want to make stuff up, but we got to give these people some background as to who these people are and what we've been able to uncover about them. We want to provide factual analysis only. We do not want to make assumptions necessarily. We want to base the narrative off of verified data. So we don't want to just assume something necessarily. We want to get in there, and our assumptions should be based off of facts that we have seen in black and white through these transactions, or that we've seen in a behavioral context as well. We want to eliminate actionable insights. Anything that we have found that may be critical to the case, we want to draw attention to. We want to weave a coherent storyline, having your SAR narrative say this and that and this and that. Nobody can make heads or tails of kind of all these facts that you're throwing up at somebody. That's not going to get anybody anywhere. Have you ever, read a bad edited story? You're like, who did what and why? I don't know. So really understanding and really writing out the who, what, when, where, and why in a logical storyline helps them feel that they actually have something potentially more actionable. And then we want to summarize the key takeaways at the end as well of at the conclusion of the SAR. Anything that we've already involved law enforcement with, if we've closed the account, we want to reiterate why we believe that something is suspicious. A clear and concise SAR narrative is super important. It doesn't have to be a lengthy, long novel. You can get all your facts in a short narrative that can be extremely impactful. So let's talk about what an impactful narrative would be. Drink of water. All right, so SAR narratives, the opening paragraph best practice. And again, there's a handout that I would like you to download so you can kind of read through this too. I won't spend a ton of time on these particular areas, but I think they're equally as important for you to also get an example that's in that handout too, to how this is typically written. I came from an institution that, again, a large law enforcement hit rate, right? We had a great relationship with law enforcement. And we had commentary that said, we look specifically for SARs that come from your institution because they tell a good story, right? And so this was the secret formula that we used in our narratives to tell that story. So it's important for you guys to realize where and why, because there's a lot of talking heads in this space, but when you walk the walk and you actually get action from it, this is the secret sauce that we use that I'm giving to you guys so you can potentially review and hopefully put into play at your institution. So the SAR narrative opening paragraph needs to be factual and concise. Again, let's reiterate, when they get that SAR narrative from you guys in their database, it is one long, awful looking, old DOS looking string of text, right? Like nauseating. I'm not reading that if my first two sentences are not juicy. Give me the juice, tell them why they should be investigating this. Don't make stuff up, make it factual, but make it enticing. I give a good example in that handout of what an enticing opening sentencing would be. The particular one that I wrote on was human trafficking. That's a subject near and dear to my heart. I think it's that what you'll see in those examples kind of crafts what it's like. It's okay to assume that somebody, based on their behavior and activity, might be human trafficking. You're not saying that it's a fact that this person is human trafficking. That's not for you to determine. You don't have to go investigate this any further. You just have to say, based on the transactions, I think you should know about this because it's indicative of a certain behavior. Don't be going out investigating and going into nail salons trying to find human trafficking and reporting on that. I don't want anybody to put themselves in danger. But based on what you have seen and based on red flags and other things, subjects you have learned, spell out what you might think it is in the beginning. It's okay to assume in that regard because the transactions are evident of that. So if it is the assumption that it's human trafficking, say it. And the more key terms that you can use and buzzwords that you can use, especially from that page where you have to check those boxes that says, this instrument was used, or this might be fraud, or this might be elder abuse, or whatever, the more you can use that in the narrative, the more those key terms pop in the database for them to look at. So make your first 2 sentences juicy. Do not give a dissertation about your institution. I have seen institutions who write a long narrative on how and when their bank was created, what their asset size in their first opening paragraph. None of their SARs ever got hits because nobody's going to look at that. Don't do that. Don't be that person. Step 2, subject information best practices. This can be a very short paragraph. You're simply there to tell them who it is that is the subject. You've already entered the subject information earlier in the SAR, so you don't need to be giving addresses. You don't need to be doing all this. They have that. The purpose of you iterating further on the subject is while you can dump all these names in those subject fields, that doesn't mean law enforcement has the context of how they're related to the activity that you believe is suspicious. So in that subject area, you need to be sitting there and kind of describing what you do know about this subject and what you've been able to research based on what you have from your own core database or any type of adverse media, watch list alerts, whatever investigative tools that you've had, whatever research you've done, you've been able to figure out who this individual is, put that in there. A lot of times it's based around, this is a subject, this is who they told us they were employed by when they onboarded. That's evidence to be true based on the direct deposits received biweekly from XYZ company. No further research was able to be found on the business or the individual based on internet searches, so on and so forth. Anytime you can help them understand who the subjects are and how they're related to the activity, give them that information in this section. Don't make it a long thing. Keep it short, concise. In your SAR narrative itself, we want to have the suspicious activities detailed. We need to be able to tell our story in a concise storyline, and we don't need to list out every single transaction that happened. They're going to see that summary of transactions in the SAR, the total dollar amount of suspicious activity. You can summarize the credit activity and the debit activity and point out certain transactions for that summarization of the credit activity that's suspicious or debit activity that's suspicious, and call out certain transactions if you choose to. But if it's more of like smaller microtransactions that aggregated to something bigger, they don't want to read that again, that long check string. Who cares? They're not going to care about that. They want to say, is this dollar amount worth me investigating? Help them understand how that storyline, how you got to believe something was suspicious. This is super important because without those details, they're going to have no idea or care less about what you have written. If you think it's human trafficking, tell them why you believe it's human trafficking. Tell them the credits that made you believe it, the debits, the behavior of the individual in the institution if he came by or she came by. It can be numerous things. Sometimes your story narratives do have to be longer. I've had ones that are super complicated and unfortunately had to get really lengthy, 7-8 pages long, but that's because the activity was insane and there was no other way to describe it other than kind of laying out how we got to conclude this person was doing something so egregious. Don't limit yourself to only being 3 paragraphs if that doesn't tell the whole story, but also, make sure that you're clear and you're concise on what it is that you found suspicious and you're supporting evidence to do so. Your action item details paragraph should be, what have you done as an institution? Did you contact law enforcement? Did law enforcement contact you first? Did you close the account? If you haven't closed the account, why not? Sometimes most institutions will do the 3 strikes, you're out rule. First SAR, second SAR, third SAR, you're out the door. If your institution doesn't have that practice in place, maybe you should consider why you're still letting some of these actors come in here and continue to use your institution for something you're finding illicit. The only reason you should continue to let somebody conduct illicit activity that you believe is suspicious at your institution is if law enforcement has asked you to keep that account open. It's one thing if it's one or two SARs every 6 years, whatever, something happens occasionally, you can't justify it, that's fine. But if you are filing an initial SAR and a reoccurring and a reoccurring and a reoccurring and a reoccurring and a reoccurring, blah, 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 on a business or an individual, then you are somewhat aiding that illicit activity, and that's room for your regulators to have a stern conversation for you. And I don't want to have those conversations with my regulator. So I encourage people to adopt a 3 strikes you're out. And if law enforcement is asking you to keep an account open so they can watch an individual, they know where the money is coming in and out of, all that, have them write you a letter. It says it in the FFIEC manual, but document it, document who you spoke with, and get a letter from them and tell them that you are only willing to do this for a certain amount of time, and that after a certain amount of time, you're going to need a refresher, because sometimes law enforcement starts to investigate something, don't find anything. Don't inform the institution they don't care anymore. So that institution is still filing SARs, but this keep open letter is just just useless anymore. They could have closed the account. So have some type of that in your procedures as well. So maybe every 6 months or so, you have them refresh that keep open letter. And then your SAR conclusion should be something around reiterating what it is that why you filed the SAR to begin with. Don't write a long dissertation again, 3-4 sentences. In conclusion, we filed this SAR again for human trafficking because XYZ. We have closed the account, blah, 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 blah. We have notified so and so and so. It can be short and concise. What we want to do is just basically reiterate that first opening paragraph. So if they get to the bottom and they kind of got sleepy as they were going through your narrative because it wasn't quite as juicy in the middle, we want to remind them at the bottom very quickly, oh yeah, that's why I even got this far, was because I'm reiterating what I put in that first paragraph. Let's talk about law enforcement collaboration. So that was the kind of secret sauce to writing a really compelling narrative. Again, download that handout. It will also come in the follow-up stuff as well. But it's important to keep that kind of same formula every time you're doing a SAR, because you're going to find that you're also going to get quicker, you're going to get better, you're going to get juicier, you're going to become this really cool like detective reporter that's getting to tell the juiciest of stories that people are interested in hearing, and they're not just juicy, they're true. So that's really exciting. I love that part about the work that we do in this field. When you're talking about law enforcement collaborations, there's very, very many different ways to go about it. The top 4 are partnerships, right? So collaborative programs. There are a lot of different cities, bigger cities, that have a collaboration between law enforcement and financial institutions. So they get together on whatever set cadence, maybe it's once a month, once a quarter, and they kind of share not specific names, but kind of trends they're seeing at their institution of what kind of activity. Law enforcement shares the same. We're sharing typologies among there, so that we can kind of better understand. Law enforcement can be informed about kind of what we're seeing trend-wise. We can see what they're doing, and so we can dial in our program further to kind of match what they're seeing as well. And so that collaboration, that open dialogue, allows you to really dial in what you're looking for and really can help you mitigate some risks at your institution. Information sharing kind of feeds into that as well. There are, we're information sharing through the suspicious activity reports. It's really, when you file your suspicious activity reports, if it's juicy enough, if it's warranted enough, if it's something like terrorist financing or something like that, you have to report that to law enforcement. That's no ifs, ands, or buts. If it is something that is egregious, or you've received a national security letter, something along those lines, you have investigated and now you're reporting to law enforcement. There are times when you are required to report to them. If there's something that you think is juicy and egregious enough that they should know about, and it's something that maybe you have heard trend-wise is going on or haven't, creating a relationship with law enforcement allows you to reach out to them when you do find something. You file your SAR, you reach out, you say, FBI agent so-and-so, I filed a SAR, and the case number is XYZ, the SAR, whatever case number is, this is what happened. We encourage you to look at it. And then you may find yourself getting a subpoena for more information shortly. That's great. That's what you wanted. Training and workshops is also important too. So, both sides of the house, having a training session, kind of partnership initiatives kind of falls under the same line. That's more of a collaborative conversation. Training is saying, okay, here's the trends that we have seen. This is the training that we're doing to deter it. This is what we trend and see that's coming. And that can go from both the law enforcement and the BSA side, is just kind of keeping each other informed from that training perspective. And response coordination, again, that goes back to who do I contact, when do I contact them, do I contact anybody at all? If I get contacted, do I freak out? No, you don't freak out. You stay calm. If it's not something you've detected yet, that doesn't mean your systems are broken. A lot of times we would get subpoenas for stuff that was maybe years old, and then we would freak out because we'd say, how did we miss that? But it was, our perimeters were not set for that. It was an outlier. You're not doing anything wrong if you're getting some law enforcement inquiries and it's not something you've reported on either. I've received my share of national security letters in the past, and that is the scariest thing to get in the mail and have to respond to, because you think that you are housing a terrorist, and in some cases you are. But you really need to take that time to figure out in your community who you can collaborate with, and if it's not within your community, if your community is very small from that perspective, reach out to me. I'm happy. I've got resources all over the U.S. I've got groups of individuals and law enforcement that get together, and if I don't have somebody in your area, we can start to see if we can initiate and collaborate with one together. Law enforcement is actually required, FBI specifically, I know, and the other agencies are required to do community outreach a certain number of hours per year. So they can really check their community outreach boxes too if they're doing collaboration with these financial institutions. So proactively reaching out to them, saying you want to learn more, you want to collaborate together, they have the hours to provide you because they're required to. Some final thoughts here on the SAR response rate. I really would encourage you guys to be tracking your your contacts from law enforcement from the SARs that you filed. That will help you better dial in your SAR narratives and your collaboration with law enforcement. Enhancing your partnerships, again, getting with law enforcement. Get with me if you don't have anybody. I can kind of give you a formula for getting something started in your area as well. And then in continuous improvement. We can only get better over time. We can only learn from the things that we did. We're going to have different agencies tell us they prefer this in a SAR, this in a SAR, this in a SAR, this in a SAR. Find the formula that works for your institution, stick with that. Find the right contacts at law enforcement, and you will be just fine in doing what you really should be doing, which is reporting suspicious activities so that you can play a part in keeping the bad actors out of your community.
Excellent. Now, before we do get into our Q&A portion, which is next, we are excited to share that we here at Risk Out are embarking on our own fight against the dark side, and we're doing it by taking the BS out of BSA. We all know that manual processes for transaction monitoring, risk scoring, SAR filing, etc., it's just too tedious. Legacy BSA solutions are often slow and dated. This causes inefficiencies in the day-to-day back office operations. So that's why we at Risk Out are developing a new solution, and we want you to be a part of that solution. Our product team is working directly with interested financial institutions to test features, gather feedback, and collaborate with institutions like yours to build the transaction monitoring system that you wish you had at your fingertips in order to stop bad actors. If you'd like to get involved and receive monthly updates on our progress, you can join our Founders Program by clicking the link that is being posted in our chat box right now. We're excited to have you join. And that does bring us to our Q&A. As a reminder, you can submit any questions you'd like to have answered in the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. If you do have a question and we either don't have the time or we want to take a little bit of a deeper dive, we will be sure to follow up with you individually after today's webinar. Now, Kristen, we actually have had some good questions rolling in throughout the duration. One of these questions is, could you please provide an example of what a joint SAR would look like?
Yeah, a joint SAR, certainly. I would prefer to get back to you on the joint SAR filing because that can be very specific to institution, collaborating together. So let me take that one back and get with you directly on that one.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Kristen. We've also had a more in-depth question about closing accounts because of repeat SARs. This individual, their institution doesn't have an explicit strike policy, and they're curious on how you would recommend that they proceed when an activity isn't definitive. The example that they provided is if there was suspected tax evasion for an individual with multiple accounts, maybe business and personal, you're not certain that there's tax evasion, but you still have filed repeated SARs. What should we do?
That's a great question because it really depends on the egregiousness, right, of the activity. If it's tax evasion and you're reporting on it and you're reporting on it and you're reporting on it, that's the IRS is going to eventually pick up on that, right? If that's something they want to investigate. If you can't definitively determine that's what it is and you're comfortable with allowing that activity to still occur there, as long as you have a rationale as to why you're still letting that activity occur, and document it. As long as you've got a rationale behind your reasoning for doing something, from that perspective, you're going to be fine. Because I say that there's normally a 3 strikes you're out, but I had situations at my institution where we had the same exact thing happen, where we weren't going to close them out after 3 times because we weren't really sure if they maybe were paying taxes out of a different account. We didn't want to go ask them if they were paying taxes out of a different account. Certainly that could get awkward. So we just did the right thing by filing the SARs and nothing else was happening. So I think you're fine in that situation. I would just say if it is something that is egregious enough, you need to define what is egregious to you and then who would fall into that, or what activity would fall into that 3 strikes you're out rule.
That's great. Thank you for that, Kristen. We actually have had some people in the questions tab that have shared they agree with you. They've shared their own 2 cents at their financial institution of filing some of those cover your butt SARs of, we're not sure if it needs to be actioned upon, but you know what, we're going to do it. We're going to document it just to be safe. We don't want our regulator to come barking at us. So definitely agree with that. We did have another question come in and said, how would you navigate the sticky situation where you're filing continued SARs on the same customer for the same situation for years, but your management team is just not on board with closing that account? What do you do?
Oh man, I just think my heart sunk for you a little bit there because I've been there. I've been there. Document for yourself. Document all the conversations you've had. Document all the attempts you have personally made to tell the story of why this should be closed. All you can do is that for yourself. You are personally liable. You're a BSA officer. You're personally liable. I have personally seen a BSA officer have to go to court over a situation similar to that, and it was scary. And she ended up in court for a long time because of a situation where she tried to bring it up to management. Management was like, "This is too good of a customer. We're not closing this relationship. They're too webbed in here through commercial lending and this, that, and the other, bukus and money and all this." And what covered her was her documentation of how many times she tried to escalate it, who she talked to. So cover yourself. That's all you can do. Cover yourself.
It's good advice. Definitely a tough situation. We hope that you're able to get out of that. We had another question come in asking about the date of determination. Kristen, is that based on the BSA officer, the BSA specialist that's reviewing the activity, or is that based on something else?
That's based on how your policy and your procedure has defined it. In the FFIEC manual, it explicitly states, I've actually got it highlighted in yellow over here. It states that the activity determined to be suspicious, it can be subjective. It's really based on, it's not necessarily when the alert triggered. It's not necessarily when it was escalated to a case. It could be, most of the times, it's once it's escalated into a case and there's been a further investigation that's happened, and that larger look back on the activity to determine if it was suspicious or not has occurred and you have determined it's suspicious, that's the date. That's the date that I typically see used, is when it's escalated into a case, that deeper investigation has happened, and then that date that analyst decides it's worthy of a SAR, that's the 30-day mark. Now, I do want to say for cannabis, just for you cannabis banks on there, your first SAR filing for your cannabis, if they fall into the category of you having to file a SAR on them because they're a licensed cannabis business, that 30-day mark starts the day they open the account. That is the best practice. That's what I've heard from regulators and all that. If you have violated that in any way, or you know of anything different, you've heard anything, let me know. There's different ways to kind of talk through it with your regulator if you hadn't quite followed that to begin with. So again, that's just throwing that out there for you guys.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I believe that brings us to the end of our Q&A today. If you do have any additional questions that you maybe just didn't want to ask on this webinar, or you think warrant a deeper discussion, you guys know where to find us. We're always happy to reach out. Now, before we close, we do have one final poll question that is up on your screen today, and this is asking if you would like to connect with us here at RiskOut directly about any of the following, and that includes joining that BSA Founders Program that we just discussed, where you can kind of help mold the next generation of solutions for transaction monitoring, streamlining and automating compliance processes, unlocking new markets and revenues, compliance staffing, help and services. We are more than happy to have a conversation about any of these things. Would love to get in touch. So thank you for that. Again, we greatly appreciate everyone that's joining today. We'll actually go ahead and show all of the contact information. As you can see there, we would love for you to reach out to either us here at riskout.com, or you can get in touch with myself or Kristen directly. I want to thank Kristen for sharing all of her time and expertise with us on today's webinar. I know I learned a lot. I hope that our audience here feels the same. We greatly appreciate it. We do also have a brief survey that will pop up after you close out today's webinar. We'd love for you to take a moment to respond to that survey to give us some feedback so we know what kind of webinars you'd like to see in the future, and let us know how we did today. If you do have any additional questions, if you want to learn more about RiskOut, or if you just want to stop by and say hi, come visit us at riskout.com. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Kristen, thank you again.
Bye, guys. Thank you.